The late 1960s were years of unprecedented emergence for America's youth, a time of freedom and awareness, a summer of love and a call to action, the birth of group consciousness and the sharing of a vision. By 1969, the burgeoning youth movement was at its zenith, yet sociologists agree that it took but one man, in fact, one image, to bring the free-spirited psychedelic era to its knees. From the cover of Life magazine, the glazed, maniacal stare of this murderous, self-styled guru would serve to alternately beckon and repel the public senses for decades to come. Charles Manson had arrived. It has been said that true celebrity comes when the world knows you by one name alone. If that is the case, Charles Manson has undoubtedly entered the ranks of the immortal, not as a consummate entertainer, but instead as America's favorite boogeyman. More than 20 years after the series of gruesome murders that would assure him a probable lifelong imprisonment, the press and the public still appear to have a boundless fascination with this aging, diminutive sociopath who still appears regularly in magazines, on television, and in theaters around the world. Yet with a near-constant barrage of interviews and exposure, many questions regarding the life and crimes of Charles Manson have gone unanswered. The near-mythical status that Manson has acquired in the annals of violent crime seems curious, when one considers that, in truth, he played no physical part in the savage butchery with which he will be forever associated. Yet Manson remains, by media standards, the undisputed king of the killers, and the focus of a nation's nightmares and its wrath. How did he earn his preferred spot in the dreaded gallery of the all-time infamous? Perhaps the key to Manson's current complexity lies in his simple past. On November 12, 1934, in Cincinnati, Ohio, the man whose name the world would never forget ironically entered that world as No-Name Maddox, the son of an unwed drifter, 16-year-old Kathleen Maddox. To escape the religious fervor of her domineering mother, Kathleen's youth was spent rambling through the back hills of Kentucky with her infant son in tow. To survive, she learned to accept the favors of a succession of lonely men, one of whom would lend the name of Manson to her fatherless child. Often, while his mother would haunt roadhouses and taverns, Manson would find himself in the care of various backwoods relatives. To this day, the moonshine-still explosion which killed his Uncle Jess remains one of Charlie's most vivid childhood memories. Kathleen's wanderlust eventually led her from state to state, but young Charlie had reached an age that was just too distracting to her new boyfriends. Their collective protests caused Kathleen to place the 12-year-old in an Indiana boys' home. The streetwise youngster, however, had grown quite accustomed to the ways of the road, and soon began a cycle of escapes and recapture that would eventually land him in the famous boys' town of Father Flanagan. Yet after a stay of only 4 days, Manson and an accomplice stole a car and fled Boys Town. This action resulted in Manson's first incarceration in a juvenile home, a grim foreshadowing of the decades of institutional life to follow. During his mid-teens, Manson's defiant nature made him a constant discipline problem for authorities, and often cruel methods of punishment were utilized to curb his stormy nature. His slight, frail appearance made him a ready target for the resident bullies as well. Another rash of bold escapes and careless car thefts would delay his release until 1954, at age 19. Soon Manson would marry, and after a brief, frustrating attempt to make an honest living, Manson and his pregnant young wife would leave for California in yet another stolen automobile. As fate would have it, Charlie would again be arrested and jailed, during which time his wife decided to pack up their newborn son and move on without him. Upon his release in 1958, Manson settled in Los Angeles and soon engaged in a series of remarkably petty, illegal endeavors. The forging of a $37 check, a few minor thefts, and even a bungled attempt at pimping on the back streets of Hollywood. Due to his previous record, the collective legal effect of these offenses was harsh, and Manson was soon serving a 7-year prison sentence, the final phase of which was spent at Terminal Island. There he would trade guitar licks with Alvin Creepy Karpis of the Ma Barker Gang, and dabble in Scientology, a cultish self-help religion created by science fiction author L. Ron Hubbard. Manson actually grew content with his life at Terminal Island, And when finally facing release in 1967, he pleaded with officials to let him stay. This being a legal impossibility, Manson reluctantly ventured into a strange new world that had leapt a full decade forward. And now this unlucky, uneducated ex-convict, who had spent over 17 of his 32 years in complete confinement, was destined to spend the first months of his newfound freedom in a place where restrictions were virtually unknown. This larcenous, wayfaring hillbilly had stumbled upon the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco during the very height of the psychedelic era. Here Manson reflects on the events of that time.
You guys blame me for the 60s. And then Jared Rubin and A.B. Hoffman and Timothy Leary and Baba Ram and all the holy Moroccos, they all ran the other way when it got too nasty. They would tell their children, raise up and kill your mom and dad, but then when they raised up and killed their mom and dad, then all the people that said that ran. And then they blamed it over on me and said, oh, well, Charlie Manson's a hippie cult leader, and he made kids do all that. But none of them kids that got busted said that. It's like this, man. Back in the 40s, when I'd be on the basketball court, for example, and all the kids would say, hey, your mom's calling you, Billy. You know, so Billy would leave, and then John would leave, and Tom would leave, and I'd be out there sitting on the basketball smoking a joint. You know, and I was unaccepted. I was the outcast. So I ended up stealing a bicycle, and I went to reform school. And then I get out 10 years later, and I go back to the neighborhood, and I go back to the basketball court, and everybody's grown up, and there's a whole new wave of kids there. So we sit and we talk, and I'd say, whatever happened to Johnny? Well, he died in Korea. Well, whatever happened to Joe? Well, he's an automobile engineer in Detroit. And whatever happened to so-and-so? Well, he moved to Chicago. And then I steal a car, and I get a gun, and I go rob a few places. And then I come back out of prison after 10 years, and I go back over on the basketball court. And the time for Johnny to go home, Johnny doesn't go home. And the basketball court, there's 10 or 15 kids, and it's all the way after dark. And what are you kids doing out after dark? Well, ain't you going to go home for dinner? Oh, no, my mom kicked me out of the house. My mom's a drunk. She don't like me. In other words, the last time I got out in 67, the road that I was walking on, hey, there's a whole bunch of kids walking on the same road. I said, well, I didn't know you knew this place. Well, when I heard Timothy Leary say, tune in and drop out, I knew where they were dropping out to because I had been on the under road, on the back side of what's happening, you know. In other words, in the darkness.
The widespread rebellious climate of this period would give rise to another sociological phenomenon that would almost single-handedly provide Manson with the power to sway young minds. For the radical youth, the collective ideal of the day was to topple the prevailing social structure. Hence, they would often hail common sociopaths, derelicts, and streetwise hustlers as fellow freedom fighters. In this spectrum, ex-convicts were particularly admirable, for they were honored veterans in the war to sabotage the workaday world, and, like martyrs, had suffered for their cause. Being essentially a transient, Manson had begun to frequent communal crash pads, where music, ideals, and meals were freely shared. His colorful jailhouse tales and unique style of guitar playing made him an instant hit with local teens. He was soon regarded as the area's premier streetwise sage, and rapidly adapted his appearance to fit this treasured new role. Prior to this time, Manson's knowledge of the drug scene was limited to occasional marijuana use,